My name is Ron Calzone. I'm, among other things, the chairman of Missouri Citizens for Property Rights. You can go to mo-cpr.org and learn a little bit more about what we're all about. This is an organization that was formed expressly for the purpose of dealing with the Kelo decision from 2005. That was a U.S. Supreme Court decision that said they can take your house, your business, or your farm, not for just a road or for a school or for a public library, but they can take your home so that someone else can profit from it by building a strip mall or some profit-centered public or privately owned project. And so we're trying to amend the Missouri Constitution to prevent that. And we're going to talk a little bit right now about the importance of doing that and how we need to go about doing that, the whole genesis of this project. I'm also one of the directors of Missouri First. We've been around for a dozen years or so, maybe a little bit longer than that. And among other things, one of my responsibilities is to be a watchdog at the Capitol. So for about the last 12 years, I've been a citizen lobbyist, uncompensated whatsoever, and I kind of try to keep an eye on guys like Senator Laugher. And usually Senator Laugher's helping me out, and I don't need to keep such a close eye on him. So anyway, you might learn a little bit more about Missouri First. This is a quiz. Did we do this last time I was here? Does that look familiar? Okay. This is a quiz. What are we looking at there?
North and South Korea.
North and South Korea. Okay, that's the part of the world we're looking at. But what are we really looking at there?
Lights.
We're looking at lights down here.
Free market versus communism.
Oh man! You stole my thunder. That's exactly right. You're talking about freedom versus statism. You're talking about capitalism, and this is an old photograph. I guarantee now, South Korea is flourishing. They're eating our lunch. In fact, Pat Buchanan wrote about that this week. And up here, same basic people, same basic part of the world. They have the same basic resources, except they don't have liberty. And since they don't have liberty, these people, not only do they not have lights, but they don't have medicine when their kids are sick. These people don't have cars to go visit Aunt Betsy. Well, maybe they don't have Aunt Betsy there, but anyway, they don't get to they can't get in their car. All the cars are made down here, but they don't end up there. So they have not just do they not have lights, but they don't have all of the basic things that we take for granted in what was once a great free society like America.
Why so many lights out in the ocean there off the coast of Korea?
Those are islands that I think up there. But don't know about that. But this is a map that the Heritage Foundation puts out. What I'm trying to do right now is try to underscore to you all the importance of economic freedom. Economic freedom is not just something that professors in economics schools look at. It's not just something for eggheads. It's not just something for think tanks. This is something that comes down and affects your everyday life. And this is how the Heritage Foundation maps out the index of economic freedom. Every year, they look at every nation in the world, and they look at several indices, and they try to determine just how free you are. And the darker the color of a nation, the more economically free they are. You might notice that Canada is a darker color than the United States is now. They surpassed us about 3 or 4 years ago. We used to be just as economically free as Canada. Now, Canada is more socialistic than we are, aren't they? So why are they more economically free? The reason is that there's more to economic freedom than just socialism. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But here's what I want you to notice. Way over here, that's the Korean Peninsula. And if we could zoom in on that, can we zoom in on that? I don't think I've got a slide to zoom in on that. You'll find out that they are white. They have no color whatsoever because they rank dead last in economic freedom in the World Index. And that's why they don't have any lights, or cars, or indoor plumbing, or medicine when their kids are sick, or doctors to treat their kids. So that's the impact that economic freedom has on you. We're going to look at that in a little bit greater detail in just a minute. I'm going to show you a series of charts that help to underscore how far-reaching economic freedom, or the lack thereof, is, how it affects you in different areas. And when you have a high level of economic freedom in these charts, you have a green bar. When it's low, you have a red bar. We're going to look at these things right here. We're going to look really, I'm going to go through these really fast, so you have to look fast because I've got other things I want to get to. But you'll get the idea. Good things happen when you have lots of economic freedom in green, and bad things happen when they're red. Let's look at income per capita. Lots of income is good, right? So where you have high levels of economic freedom, good things happen. High economic freedom, higher income per capita. How about something like the income level of the poorest 10%? Capitalism is only good for the 1%, right? The 1%ers. That's not true, because a rising tide rises all ships. Even the income level of the poorest 10% in free societies do better when there's high levels of economic freedom.
Can you go back to that graph? There's another interesting thing. It's like it doesn't matter unless you have extreme economic freedom. You take away even a little bit, and poor are not helped at all.
Yeah, that's a good.
Flat.
That's a good. The fact is that oftentimes the poor are the last to be helped, and so yes, you do need high levels of economic freedom for the poor.
And it's considerable help. I mean, you're talking a factor of 4 or 5 times. That's more dramatic than the previous.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I've never really caught that before. Now, I don't really quite like this slide, because what this is supposing is that it's bad to have children in the workforce. And I'll guarantee that when I'm out doing this kind of stuff, or working on Ed Embry's campaign on the west side of the state, some of my children are back home feeding the horses and the cows, and so I want them in the workforce. But most of the world thinks that it's a bad thing to have children in the workforce. And see, when you have low levels of economic freedom, the kids have to work too, because you don't put beans on the table unless everybody's working. So if you want to do it for the children, you want economic freedom. How about life expectancy? Where you have high levels of economic freedom, you have higher life expectancy. Lower infant mortality when you have high levels. You're starting to get the point. We want economic freedom if we want to enjoy all of the things we want most out of life. And I hope you're starting to kind of look ahead a little bit. Private use eminent domain is anti-economic freedom. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. What's the greatest threat? What's the greatest threat to economic freedom? Obama. He's a pretty big threat. I'd say that's true. But it's not just Obama. You think it's socialism? Is Obama all about socialism? No, he's about more than that. It's not just socialism. What he is, he's about mercantilism. If you look at Obamacare is part socialism and part mercantilism. What does that mean? What does mercantilism mean? Well, there's 3 basic economic systems. There's capitalism and there's socialism that we all understand and we talk about, but there's also this thing called mercantilism. Last time I was here, we talked about the East India Trading Company a little bit. I've already been accused of causing someone to have to go home and do a lot of research over that. Well, mercantilism was what empowered the East India Trading Company, and that was why they had such a tremendous influence on the formation of America. Mercantilism was basically the governmental / economic system that prevailed in Europe from about 16 to 17, 1800 AD. Mercantilism is a system in which the wealthy and the connected get special favored treatment from the king. Senator, does that sound familiar? No. Special favored treatment. That's mercantilism. Mercantilism is where the aristocracy had access to the king's sword. So he could use the king's sword to force people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, like maybe give up their property, for instance. Mercantilism is where you have government-guaranteed monopolies. Does that sound familiar? That was mercantilism, and that was the East India Trading Company. They had a monopoly of the whole Eastern Hemisphere. So that was just part of what they did. Restrictions on entering the marketplace with your goods or services. That's a component of mercantilism. That's what mercantilism does. Let's see, I have another slide here. Got to push the other button. When you have taxes that inhibit the economy and freedom, that's a component of mercantilism. So what happened is we had a situation in which the people expected the king to protect them. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But instead, under King George and under the kings of France and other European countries, you had the king giving special favored treatment to certain people at the expense of other people, and that was mercantilism. Now today, we call mercantilism by other names. We sometimes call it crony capitalism. Some people that kind of understand a little bit more about history understand that mercantilism was a big component of fascism. And sometimes we use those terms interchangeably, cronyism and so forth. But let's look a little bit about, let's see. Here's some of the things that are maybe a little redundant from what I just said. These are some of the kind of things that are components of mercantilism. Most of the stuff that we don't like. Government granted and protected monopolies, government mandated use of a product like maybe ethanol, for instance. How about when a pharmaceutical company can't sell enough chickenpox vaccines, so they decide that 100 people a year dying of chickenpox nationwide constitutes an epidemic to the proportion that you've got to mandate the use of chickenpox vaccines on your kids. Those are some of the kind of things that are a part of mercantilism. And then when you allow, let's see, I should have. When you allow private parties to use government powers for their own benefit, again, that's defining eminent domain. Here's what historian and Austrian economist Murray Rothbard defines mercantilism, how he defines mercantilism. He said mercantilism, which reached its height in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, was a system of statism which employed economic fallacy to build up a structure of imperial state power as well as special subsidy and monopolistic privilege to individuals or groups favored by the state. Now, what does that sound like today? We rant and we rave about socialism. It's a statist system, and we should be concerned about it. It's pervasive. But we also have problems with mercantilism. And this is my observation in the dozen years or so I've spent at the Capitol. That is that generally speaking, Democrats use socialism as a way to accumulate power. And socialism typically appeals to lower classes. It's all about benefits and entitlements and things like that. Basically, it's a method of redistribution of wealth. But it focuses on the masses that they hope will go to the polls and vote for them. Republicans, who happen to be statists also, now I'm not saying all Republicans are, but the Republicans that are statists, they tend not to quite rely on socialism so much as they do mercantilism. And so that's why you see Republicans a lot of times pushing tax credits and special subsidies, mandating things like ethanol use and so forth. And so we have, and now there's a lot of melding, a lot of crossing over the aisle. So you have a lot of Democrats that are also embracing mercantilism. And I've been told by some Democrat leaders on the House side that Cady barred the door when Chuck Ferguson is gone, when Brad Lauger is gone out of the Senate. Tax credits are going to go berserk. They're going to go berserk. It's going to be a whole lot harder to slow it down than it was, unless we get some good people to replace these guys in the Senate. But my point is, yes, sir.
Is TIPS basically the same thing?
And TIPS fall right in that same category. That's right. TIPS, it's all about redistributing wealth. It's all about giving special favors to people that aren't well connected. And sometimes it's done by people that have all the best of intentions. Sometimes people think, yeah, if we do TIPS and if we use eminent domain and we try to encourage this big box store to move in here, then it's going to create jobs and it's going to eventually create more taxes and so forth. And they don't understand economics. They don't understand that you end up robbing Peter to pay Paul, and then Paul's got to subsidize Peter again, and it's just a big mess. You misallocate resources when you do that. We won't get into an economics lesson here, but the point is that this is nothing new. The stuff we're dealing with is nothing new. This is the same stuff that the founding fathers had to deal with. And if we had more time, I would make the case for the fact that the founding fathers fought a war against King George over mercantilism versus free market capitalism. It wasn't about religious freedom. The colonists had religious freedom. They fought that battle. They fought that battle by crossing the ocean. But we talked a little bit about the East India Trading Company last time. And they were one of the most blatant examples of mercantilistic power there was, and the colonists were scared to death of them. And so we actually fought a war over the very thing that is rearing its ugly head again, right here in Missouri and across the nation. I'm going to skip this slide because it's more of the same kind of stuff. So my point in talking about mercantilism is to point out that we have modern mercantilists that are using things like eminent domain to feather their nest, and they do so at the expense of the people whose property they're taking, but also at the expense of people who lose opportunity because the markets are messed up. We'll touch on that a little bit later on. One of the neat things about the eminent domain issue is everybody gets it. Almost everybody gets it. Unless you're a city planner, you get it. Unless you're an eminent domain attorney, you get it. And so it's a really neat thing to use as an illustration of what's a much more pervasive problem. You can use eminent domain to illustrate how government sword, the king's sword, is being appropriated and misappropriated for the benefit of some favored people at the expense of everybody else. But don't just stop thinking in those terms or being concerned about those things with respect to eminent domain, because as you pointed out, tips is part of it, targeted tax credits are part of it, and all kinds of special subsidies and privileges. I cannot have a group of people sitting still watching what I'm doing without talking about John Locke at least a little bit. I performed the ceremony when my oldest daughter got married, and I worked John Locke into the wedding ceremony. My kids would have been disappointed had I not. John Locke wrote about a lot of things. You know, John Locke was probably the single person that had the most influence on the Founding Fathers, either directly or indirectly. You know, for instance, Cato's letters that were very influential, well, they were influenced by John Locke. And so Sam Rutherford, who did a lot of writing in the Founding Fathers, he was influenced by John Locke. So these people that influenced the Founding Fathers were influenced by Locke, and then some of the Founding Fathers read Locke directly. But, you know, Locke taught that the starting point for each man is what he called the state of nature. And you were in perfect liberty and freedom to direct your own actions and your own steps. But he said that wasn't always a real good thing, because there was always somebody that had a bigger club or had more brothers or brothers-in-law or whatever that would come and beat you up and pillage you. And so they thought that maybe it would be a good idea, people that lived many, many generations ago, to form societies. And so they left this state of nature in which each man was a king unto himself, and they formed some societies, and they accepted some of the limitations of society only if society made them freer and more secure and actually enhanced liberty. Because you see, you don't have liberty, you don't have freedom if you're always in fear of the next band of marauders. And so, you know, one of the things that happened in some parts of the world is a king would get together some men, and they would hammer out some shields, and they would train with their swords, and they would learn how to ride horses with all kinds of heavy stuff on them, and they would get a round table for some reason. I'm not sure what that had to do with anything. And he would have his own little private army. And his knights would sit around the round table and talk about, I don't know what they talked about around the round table because I don't read those books, but anyway, then the king would say, come and join up with me and I'll protect you. That didn't happen everywhere, but there were places that happened. And so they would form a society around that king and that kingdom, and the king would protect them with his knights. And you know, if you didn't like that king, there were lots of kings, you might move down the road and you might hook up with another king that did a better job protecting you, or maybe was more fair or whatever. And so people accepted they would be taxed by the king. They would lose some of their liberties because the king had some authority over them, but they expected protection from the king. And that's why people join in societies. That's what Locke explained. He said, people join in societies with others for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property. Now understand, to Locke, property wasn't just bricks and mortar and soil and timbers. It was your lives, liberties, and your estates. All of those things are your property. And James Madison, by the way, wrote some things that were similar to that. He goes on to say that the chief the great and chief end thereof of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property, their life, their liberty, and their states. That was the main reason people entered into society. Now, you might notice some of these terms, like state of nature. That sounds kind of like this phrase that we're familiar with, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature's God entitled them. Anybody know where that comes from?
Declaration.
It's from the Declaration of Independence. See, the Founding Fathers, at least TJ, was borrowing directly from John Locke with these concepts. He went on to say, well, this is actually in another part. He said, the reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property, and the end why they choose and authorize a legislative is that there may be laws made and rules set as guards and fences to the properties of all the members of society. Laws are supposed to be protecting us. They're supposed to be making us more free, not taking away our liberty on net. Now, is that happening today? Sometimes it does. A lot of times it doesn't. But then he went on to say, whenever legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people or reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people. When laws are made that take away your liberty rather than enhance it, government puts itself into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience, and are left to the common refuge which God hath provided all men against force and violence. Now, put yourself back in the shoes of the Founding Fathers. If you think we've got it bad, they had it even worse. And they were going to have it even worse if the East India Trading Company was allowed to do business in the colonies, which is what they were afraid of. We don't have time for that today. But see, these men and women were English subjects. These were God-fearing people, by and large. And they felt like they had an obligation to the king, a certain level of obligation. Why in the world would they take up arms and say, we want to be separate from you? It wasn't really a revolution, it was a secession, wasn't it? Why would they say, we want to be separate from you, and thumb their nose? You know, our neighbors to the north were invited to join in that effort. But Canada decided to stay loyal to the king. So they didn't quite see it like the colonists, like the 13 colonists did. Well, they felt justified because the king had put himself into a state of war with the people. That was their moral, spiritual, scriptural justification for going to war and killing redcoats if it was necessary to establish their freedom. Instead of King George protecting their liberty, protecting their life, protecting their estates, their property, he had become a usurper of it, and therefore was at war with them. Now I want to show you something that really excites me. We spend a lot of time talking about the United States Constitution. The Missouri, remember that first quote I had up there from TJ? If you read it, remember it said that the states are responsible for protecting the things that are nearest and dearest to you. You better learn the Missouri Constitution if you really want to know what our legislators and our public officials owe us, what their job is. At least read the Bill of Rights. This is the third clause of the Missouri Constitution, right after the preamble that recognizes God as the supreme lawgiver, and after Article 1, Section 1 that says all political power is vested in the people, and the people, the government derives its power from the people. Here, it defines the role of government. It's this concise. It's this simple. And this is the very thing that you need to put it, in fact, I've got it on the back of my business cards. And it's great. If you've got a legislator that's got a bill that's mercantilistic or it's liberty stealing, show them this quote right here. So you took an oath to support and defend this. This is your job one. It says that all constitutional government is intended to promote the general welfare of the people. Now what that means, general welfare, is not entitlement programs. That's saying that everybody has to be treated equally. That's what general welfare means. That means you can't have the special favored treatment that King George was meting out to the aristocracy. That means that you can't give Paul McKee hundreds of millions of dollars worth of tax credits because that's not for the general welfare. It's not equal treatment for everybody. That all persons have a natural right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the enjoyment of the gains of their own industry. You have a right to the enjoyment of the gains of your own industry. That all persons are created equal and are entitled to equal rights and opportunity under the law. And look at this. To give security to these things is the principal office of government. How many times have you heard that constitutionally, based on the Missouri Constitution, education is the most important function of government? Senator, have you ever heard that before?
A few times.
Do it for the children, right? Do it for the children. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that. Now, it gets a big chunk of the budget, constitutionally, but nowhere does it say that that's the principal office of government. Instead, it says securing our liberty is the principal office of government. And when it doesn't do that, when government doesn't confer that security of our liberty, it fails in its chief design. It's that important. That is the job of the legislators. That is the job of the governor. That is the job of the lieutenant governor. That is the job of the dog catcher. And everybody in between is to secure our liberty. That's what they took an oath to do. And so my suggestion is if you look at any piece of legislation, and if it in any way detracts from these things, the things that are the principal office of government, then you better look again. No matter what other good you think it might do, because these things are the principal office of government. So you understand where I'm going to. With respect to eminent domain, with respect to the protection of your property rights, Missouri government is failing in its chief design. Because a developer can still cozy up to a city council or a mayor, and he can still convince them to declare an area blighted, and they can still use eminent domain to take that piece of property and convey it to Stan Kroenke or some big developer. So what is eminent domain? Eminent domain, it's kind of I can't tell you how many times I've seen people write eminent domain with an I, eminent domain. And sometimes it is eminent. Eminent domain is sometimes eminent for some people. But eminent domain is, we could go into the etymology of the words, but we won't do that. But basically it's the power to force the sale of private property and convey that property, it used to be, to just government. That's the traditional definition of eminent domain. Is eminent domain bad? Poll. Is eminent domain bad? Not necessarily. Very good. That's very good. That's debatable with some people. Some of my really staunch libertarian friends will say it's always bad no matter what period. And I have a tendency to want to feel that way. But you know, traditionally what we've said is that if there's point A and point B and it needs to be connected by a road and there's a really strong reason, a compelling state interest in doing so, and the only way to do it is to go through Pete's property and Pete says, I'm just not going to sell. Then traditionally we've used eminent domain to force the sale and we treat him justly, we give him just compensation, and then that road is then built and a public purpose has been served. But that public purpose used to be defined as a situation in which the public owned and the public used the property. And so that's what eminent domain used to be. But what has it become? That's what it's become. A tool of private developers to circumvent the free market. And so sometimes when you can't justify building a new whatever it is, because the market's not demanding it, you go to government and you want subsidies. You want some kind of help from government. And one of the things you do is you get government to take the property so you don't have to pay as much for it. Or you get government to take the property because you like that piece of property rather than the one that's for sale across the highway, because access is better for whatever reasons. So we've gone a long way. We've come a long way from what it started out being to what it is now. In 2005, the United States Supreme Court handed down what's now referred to as the Kelo decision. A lady named Suzette Kelo owned a piece of property in New London, Connecticut. A company that makes little blue pills had just relocated their world headquarters in New London, Connecticut. And they really didn't have anything directly to do with the eminent domain, but they told New London, we'll build this magnificent facility here. They bought that property. They didn't use eminent domain to get it. But all this property around it, we're going to bring in, let me back up a minute, we're going to bring in some of the most eminent scientists from around the world to work at this research facility. We're going to bring in the cream of the crop. And these people, these were just kind of poor neighborhoods around here. These people want shops and hotels and things to do. They want fancy apartments and fancy homes. And so New London, Connecticut was tasked with building up all of this area around where Pfizer built their World Research Headquarters. And so there was this lady named Suzette Kelo that owned some little piece of property. I wish I knew where it was, somewhere over here, I'm not sure. She didn't want to sell. It was literally a little pink house, but it was her dream house. She didn't want to sell it. So she took them all the way to the Connecticut Supreme Court and then all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. How many of you all know Dave Rowland? Okay, more of you need to know Dave Rowland. Dave Rowland started the Missouri Freedom Center, or the Freedom Center of Missouri, actually what it's called. The Freedom Center of Missouri. It's a public interest law firm. Before that, he worked for the Show Me Institute. Before that, he worked for the Institute for Justice. The Institute for Justice represented Mrs. Kelo free gratis. And they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, spent a lot of time and a lot of money. They ended up losing. And that's a long story. Dave Rowland, one of my heroes, was on the litigation team that litigated that case before the U.S. Supreme Court when he was with IJ. Now Dave Rowland is here in Missouri with a public interest law firm that's very much like the Institute for Justice, where he has become a tremendous resource for patriots around the state. And I'm saying all that to say this, is that they need to raise some money. And so that just put that in the back of your mind. You'll probably be seeing some emails flying around and some Facebook traffic. We want to keep them in Missouri because Dave Rowland and his wife Jennifer, who also work for IJ, are really important to the future of Missouri. So this Kelo decision in 2005 was one in which the Supreme Court said that Article 5, the Fifth Amendment, not Article 5, the Fifth Amendment, which we used to think protected us from private use eminent domain, didn't. They said in the Kelo decision that as long as there's some public benefit from the taking of private property, then you could use eminent domain. Well, guess what's public benefit? That's right. So here we are in Sunset Hills. Everybody knows about this issue here. When you take property from a little old lady that owns a very modest house and you convey that to somebody that's going to build a shopping center, who's going to generate more taxes? And so more taxes means that the public is benefited, right? That means that they can use eminent domain to take the little lady's house and convey it to somebody, some wealthy developer that's going to pay more taxes because of public purpose. Guess what? How many of you drive your car, say, less than 15,000 miles a year? Okay, I want your car. Because I drive a lot more than that. And when I'm going to get the government to help me take your car from you, convey it to me, I'll come up with some price, that's just compensation. And I can justify that because there'll be a public benefit. Because I'm going to drive it more. And I'm going to wear out more tires. And I'm going to buy more fuel. And more mechanics are going to get to work on my car. If my daughter gets it, then a lot more body damage. But you see, it would be a public benefit just simply because I'm using your car more. Now, how just is that? Does anybody feel a little bit like the colonists might have felt with King George about now? So the Kelo decision said that it's not just a public use. That doesn't mean anything. But as long as there's a public benefit, they can use eminent domain. Okay, let's see. One of the things that they...
What was that decision vote? Was it 5-4?
It was 5-4. It was 5-4.
Kennedy on the wrong side?
Yeah.
He's on the wrong side.
So, but one of the things that they did in the Kelo decision is they made it very clear that states can enact stricter property rights protections than the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution supplies with their interpretation. And so in 2005, in the summer of 2005, then Governor Blunt formed what he called the Eminent Domain Task Force. And so this was a group of, I've forgotten how many, dozen, 15 or 16 people. Half of them were condemnation lawyers. And they were supposed to study the problems with eminent domain in Missouri. They issued a report in December, I think it was, of 2005. And so 2006 was the year for the Missouri legislature to address this problem that everybody across the nation was up in arms. When you polled it, 85 to 95% of the people said, this is a travesty. We cannot allow this to continue. Let's do something about it. Missouri was rated by the Institute for Justice. Let's see, where's that here? It was rated by the Institute of Justice as one of the 3 worst eminent domain abusers. New York, Kansas, and Missouri were the 3 worst eminent domain abusers. But they also said that Missouri has model language in their constitution, language that other states should imitate in their constitutions to stop eminent domain abuse. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The Missouri General Assembly passed something called House Bill 1944 in 2006. It was a result of the studies that the Governor's Commission looked into and a whole lot of wrangling through the legislature. House Bill 1944, Senator, was the only eminent domain bill that got a hearing. The only eminent domain bill that got a hearing that year. Lots of them were filed, but that's the only one that got a hearing. There was one other one that was kind of thrown in with some TIF stuff, and it kind of got a hearing when they all rolled them in together, but it was not ever intended to go anywhere. It's kind of a long story. But they passed House Bill 1944 in 2006. It went into effect August 28th of 2006. In September of 2008, the residents of Sugar Creek got a letter from the city of Sugar Creek saying, we want to build something called Sugarland Development. And we want your homes to do it. And they said, if you don't sell them, we can use eminent domain. But wait a minute, how could that be? Because they just passed House Bill 1944. They just fixed eminent domain abuse, right? How can Sugar Creek say, we're going to take your home and we're going to use it to build a shopping center called Sugarland Development? It's because it was a placebo. It did nothing. It feathered the caps of some people that claimed that they were really protecting property rights. But it did virtually nothing to stop the taking of one man's private property and conveying it to someone else. Put some roadblocks in it, maybe make them pay a little bit more, but they didn't stop it. This is evidenced by what happened in Sugar Creek, Missouri. So why would you say that, why would IJ say that Missouri had model language when we had that language in our Constitution before the 2006 fix? We had it in our Constitution after the 2006 quote fix. And people were still losing their homes. This is what has been in the Missouri Constitution since 1875. We have a clause that says that private property shall not be taken for private use with or without compensation. How more clear could it possibly be? You cannot take private property for private use. You just can't do it. It's in the Constitution. That was what prevailed in Missouri until 1945. The 1945 Constitution brought in a lot of bad stuff. But this is one of the things that happened in 1945. We adopted Article 6, Section 21, that says laws may be enacted, and any city or county operating under a constitutional charter may enact ordinances providing for the clearance, replanting, reconstruction, redevelopment, and rehabilitation of blighted, substandard, or insanitary homes, areas. Homes would be bad enough, But what this 1945 constitutional clause said is that if you can find a home here and a home there and a sidewalk that's cracked here and a pothole there. So what does that tell you about what we have to do to fix the problems with eminent domain in Missouri? House Bill 1944 was doomed the moment it was filed, no matter what might have happened to it, because it was simply a statute. If it was going to amend the Constitution, it would have had to have been an HJR, a House Joint Resolution, or an SJR, a Senate Joint Resolution. But since it was just an HB, a House bill, it was only going to change the statutes, and the statutes can never trump Article 6, Section 21 of the Constitution. The only way to solve the problem is to amend the Missouri Constitution. That's the only way to do it. And that's why some of us understood and fought tooth and nail again, that we understood that House Bill 1944 could not solve the problem, and we fought tooth and nail over it. And that's why some of us today think that we need to continue fighting this battle to amend the Missouri Constitution. Those were some of the bogus provisions in House Bill 1944 I won't go into because I'm talking too long as it is already. So this is what happens. This is kind of the mechanics, the etymology of a taking. A city declares an area blighted, substandard, or insanitary, or they can call it a conservation area. Again, it's areas and not properties. And then, what happened? And then what happened? Okay, then what happened is, what happens is that they go through gyrations and they use about 3 sections of statute and they figure out how to convey that, take that property through the legal system and convey it to somebody. Now I want to show you some of these blighted properties. That's a blighted house. And what I showed you earlier, that's a blighted house. That's blighted. The whole neighborhood looks like that. There's more blight. That's blight. That's blight. That's blight. That's blight.
Please don't show my house. No, those are better than mine. Those lawns are mowed.
One of the problems with the way we're dealing with things now is that cities have incentive to call an area blighted, like maybe all of North St. Louis. And what does that do to investment in that area?
Drives it away.
Absolutely. The people in this community here, when they were under a blight designation for so long, they're not going to remodel their kitchen. They're not going to paint their house or put a new roof on their house because any time now they might get that fateful letter in the mail. And then their property might be taken and they will not get that investment back out of their house. So the way we're dealing with resolving blight in Missouri and the way we're using eminent domain is actually causing more of the very thing that it purports to solve. It puts people in what we call eminent domain limbo. I'm going to whip through this. Michelle's standing up over there. I think she's about to axe me.
We never actually.
So what ends up happening then is the natural organic development is stifled. And then you misallocate resources. You build a shopping center where they really don't need a shopping center, and then half the stores stay empty. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, that's exactly right. Remember what the Kelo decision said. States can enact stricter protections. That's what we're trying to do. House Bill 1944 didn't do it. Some of the provisions that had a little bit of meaning have been reversed by the courts since 2006. And we have not been able to get the legislature to step up to the plate since then. And the reason is because average citizens don't have the sway that the big developers and the money people do. So what's the solution? The solution is the thing that we talked about the last time I was here. Anybody remember what that was? What I was supposed to be talking about?
Initiative.
That's right, the ballot initiative process. Now this is where I get to give Senator Brad Lager a shout out. I wouldn't have thought to do this if he wasn't standing here. For the last 5 years, there has been a concerted effort to take away the power that the people of Missouri have reserved for themselves in Article 3, Section 49 of the Missouri Constitution. There has been a concerted effort to make it impossible, harder, much harder, if not impossible, for average citizens to use the initiative petition process. Now, sometimes the initiative petition process, as we talked about before, gets used for some really stupid things, like minimum wage and Prop B and things like that. Okay, but we need it because it's like the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment's not about hunting and target shooting. It's not even totally about keeping your family safe from the marauders. It's about keeping government in check, right? Mm-hmm. Our right to the initiative petition process is about keeping government in check. When government is unresponsive, when government is taking away our liberty, oppressive is the word I was looking for. They're unresponsive or they're oppressive, then sometimes the people have to resort themselves to making an end run around the legislature. Well, for 5 years, the General Assembly has been, or some members of the General Assembly have been trying to take this away from us. The first year that happened, the bill went all the way through the House. It just skated through. It skated through the Senate. It was, do you remember the last couple of days? You probably don't even remember this. You probably don't even remember this. It's just one small thing. I was fighting tooth and nail by the time that thing got over to the Senate. There's this great big bald senator, I won't mention Kevin Engler's name, that was really pushing this thing. And I was fighting him tooth and nail, but he had the upper hand, and he had it on the Senate floor, and it was just minutes away from passing. And a certain senator whose name I won't mention, but is in this room right now, whispered in his ear, and he said, "I wouldn't bring this up again." And he pulled it out of the drawer, pulled his drawer out, and put that bill in the drawer, and we never saw the bill the rest of that, because the session was about over anyway. So Senator Lauger protected your right to use the initiative petition process. Had that bill passed, I would not be trying to take eminent domain to the people on the ballot because it would be too expensive and too hard. Now, the big moneyed interests would still be able to do it had that bill passed, but the grassroots people wouldn't have. And so Senator Lauger, I think it might be the best thing that he ever did in the legislature. He might not even realize it. And then each year since then, he's helped in maybe less profound ways because the bill hasn't gotten this far. The next year the bill came along and we kind of stopped it early in the process. And the next year we actually hijacked and turned it on its head, so it was a favorable bill. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is this is the only way we're going to stop eminent domain abuse in Missouri. It's going to be an uprising of the people. We're going to have to mobilize. In 2008 we did that. In 2008 we raised $800,000. We had a whole plethora of volunteers. We collected 428,000 signatures. We have two different places we have to amend the Constitution to fix the problem. So we had 2 petitions. We missed ballot access by about 2,000 or 3,000 votes in one congressional district. That's how close we got. Well, since then, since 2008, the Missouri Municipal League and RCGA and the other people that have a vested interest in keeping eminent domain for private use alive have been fighting us tooth and nail in the court. They've been using delay tactics, just simply litigating ballot titles and things like that, so we would run out of time and not have time to collect signatures. That's where we've been since 2008. Every year we go to court and we're fighting the Missouri Municipal League, and then the Secretary of State is throwing roadblocks in our way. And not so much the auditor, the old auditor was, but it's been a tough fight. This next year is our year. We will have a new Secretary of State.
Yes.
But even if we end up with a ballot title from the other Secretary of State, we've been through court so many times, all the judges know me now. It's like I've taken up residence in Cole County Court and Western Court of Appeals. And so every time we go through court, we get through faster. It takes less time. So I'm confident that this next time, one way or the other, we're going to actually have time to collect signatures. What does our petition do? And I'm almost done. One of the things it does is it creates a very clear definition of what public use is. And that doesn't allow me to take your car because I'll drive it more and wear out more tires. It also keeps government from using eminent domain to hoard property when they have no immediate public use for it. It also keeps government from feigning a public use when really they're taking this property just so that they can maybe a year later convey it to the mayor's brother-in-law who happens to own a tavern next to and needs a new parking lot expansion. That's actually happened. It ensures that utilities, including electric cooperatives, can secure rights of way, but it doesn't let them take fee title of the property. Remember the Katy Trail? I won't go into any more details about that, but it deals with the Katy Trail type of issues. Then we also have to amend Article 6. There we eliminate this blight excuse for using eminent domain. And there we refocus the role of government for that of protecting the rights of innocent neighbors when somebody's got a bad piece of property. If you live next to me and my sewer line busts and is draining through your kid's playground in your backyard, I'm violating your rights. And there should be some way for you to deal with me. But see, the way we do it right now is a circle gets drawn around your house and mine. They call it blighted, and we both lose our property. But what we should do is we should use code enforcement to deal with some slob that lives next to you. And that's an appropriate use of government power. So anyway, bottom line is that that's what the importance of eminent domain is. It goes back to the very core principles of our constitutional republic. That's what's happening in Missouri now, and this is what we need to do to fix it. And so I'll either sit down and shut up or take questions. What will it be, Michelle?
If we have a couple questions, that'd be fine.
Okay.
In the Kelo decision, what was their justification for allowing the take rights?
Well, one of the things to understand is the Kelo decision was not just a flip of the switch, an opening of the door, a radical departure from what had happened. Like so many other constitutional principles, they had eroded over the years. And there were things like takings to build grist mills back in the 1800s, and then there were takings to build railroads, and the meaning of public use just slowly evolved further and further, just like so many things, just like the Interstate Commerce Clause has eroded more and more. Hopefully next week, the Supreme Court is going to maybe put a little bit more box around the Interstate Commerce Clause. But the thing that it did, the thing the Kelo decision did, is it brought awareness not only to patriots like us, but also to city councils and mayors, especially across Missouri. And so when the Kelo decision came down and they made it very clear that you could use eminent domain just to increase the tax base, a lot more eminent domain began to be used. So it activated our side, but it also activated the other side. Good question, though. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about the use of tax credits and TIFs and the role that they play in incentivizing the use of eminent domain for private use?
Well, they kind of build one on the other. Sometimes a project is not economically feasible unless you can acquire the land that you want at the price you want. And so they need that to enable a project. And sometimes they need some kind of other subsidies, whether it's tax credits or some form of TIFs or whatever it is. What's the road district? There's TIFs, and then for roads there's something else. I forgot what it is now. But basically getting subsidies because it's not economically feasible. So sometimes a project is so economically indefensible that you've got to have both the tax subsidies and also cheap ways of acquiring property. If you had one or the other, it might not work. Some projects would probably be economically feasible without those things, but the developer just simply wants more profit, so he's going to get everything he can and pit one community against the other. But it's all part of the package. When you get the tax breaks and you acquire the property at a lesser price, it just decreases the cost of the whole project development. Is that kind of what you're after, or is it more than that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, it sounds like the abuses go hand in hand, but to what extent is like one used versus the other? Typically do you see properties both acquired through eminent domain and then granted tax credits for some reason and then also granted TIFs?
I think that about any time eminent domain is used, you'll see the other tools, development tools, being used as well. But not every time you see TIFs and other tax credits used will you see eminent domain used.
Well, would it be possible to approach the problem then, but legislatively, by restricting the use of tax credits and TIFs to only property that has not been acquired through eminent domain. In other words, like you kind of whittle away at the.
Well,
at
in
the
fact,
problem.
the bill, the Paul McKee bill, when we had the Paul McKee special session about 3 or 4 years ago in the middle of the summer, that said that Paul McKee would get a 50% tax credit on property that he acquired unless he used eminent domain. Then he didn't get his tax credit on that piece of property. Okay, so now how do you define using eminent domain? If I happen to be packing a gun, and I got my gun out and I pointed it at Lloyd and I said, Lloyd, empty your wallet. But he complied.
Too late.
Did I use that gun on him?
Not
I
technically.
didn't shoot him. But see, what happens is the hammer of eminent domain is held over someone's head, and they usually capitulate because we could go into the legal labyrinth of trying to protect your property and how terribly expensive it is and what a loser it is to usually try to do that. But usually people capitulate, and then they end up going into some negotiation and sell the property. And so even if some developer like Paul McKee threatened to use eminent domain, if he didn't actually do it, he gets his credit.
Okay, because he's decreased the property values.
Well, no. What I'm saying is
Okay.
that with a specific given piece of property, to have used eminent domain, he had to go through the condemnation process, not
Okay.
just threaten.
Okay.
But if the threat of eminent domain causes people to capitulate, you tell me, was eminent domain used or not? Well, I would say if I pulled out a gun and I pointed it at Lloyd and I said, give me your wallet, I used the gun in that crime. I didn't have to pull the trigger. And that's how eminent domain is. So that's that is one of the reasons it won't work. Another important dynamic to understand is that the definitions of blight that work for eminent domain are the same definitions of blight that they use to determine whether or not a TIF is available. And so had the General Assembly, smartened up, I guess I should say, the definition of blight, then TIFs would go away and try to do that. Try to take TIFs away. It's about as hard as taking tax credits away. So there's just, the more of that you take away, the more big money interests there are fighting the process. We've got to take this directly to the people. Yes, sir.
2 questions. One, I assume Missouri's still about 3rd worst in the country. Do you have recent information?
Well, nobody's terribly bad with eminent domain right now because the economy stinks so bad. But just in the last few months, we're starting to see, it's reared its ugly head in St. Louis and in Columbia, and so it's coming back around again. Missouri definitely has the capacity to be the worst when things get better because we have one of the worst laws.
The polling data on this eminent domain issue, to me, whatever I've seen on it, it's been off the charts.
85, 95%. Yep.
How the hell does nothing get done on an issue that has that kind of overwhelming public support?
Money and power.
80%.
Because the guy
Opposition
that doesn't do anything about eminent domain does something else that's good that you like that will cause you to vote for him. Eminent domain, this is part of the deal too. Eminent domain is a mile wide, inch deep issue. Unless you have been the victim of eminent domain abuse or you know somebody, you're just so worried about it. That's why I start this presentation out with showing how important economic freedom is. And the thing I'm trying to, this is a good way to end the presentation, because the thing you need to understand is that if we don't have economic freedom, everything crumbles and we look like North Korea. And there's probably no more blatant abuse of property rights than taking someone's home or their business from them and conveying it to somebody else because they're better connected or they're going to increase tax revenue. There's a project up north of here. I'll get to it in a second, sir. There's a project up north of here, and one of the properties that they were taking was a little Oriental restaurant. It's owned by a lady that was a boat lady from Vietnam. It was literally a boat lady from Vietnam. And she spoke very poor English, and she said, they didn't even do this in Vietnam.
Wow.
They didn't even do this in Vietnam. So she escaped.
Crown Candy project that you're talking about?
I'm not even sure what it's called. It's a big, long development along Olive or Page or something up there. It's been too long since I've been up there. Yes, sir.
As an added tidbit, down off Lockborough and 55, Lowe's came in and took out a whole bunch of homes. One little old lady held out. She got double the price for her house. Yeah. So she went along with the program finally, but her neighbors disappeared. No longer had neighbors. They all were knocked to the ground. Item 2, Charlie Dooley's got another project on his mind down by the boat. He's going to eliminate about 50 homes, plus Hancock School. Put in a strip mall. This is proposed, hasn't passed, but eminent domain's on his list.
If he can do that through free market forces, more power to him.
If he can buy up all them homes, great. How are they going to buy a school?
Yeah. Don't co-opt the king's sword to do it. So, thank you for your patience with me.